Good morning. Sorry. Yeah, there's no more. I don't see it. We are on Kuf Yud Amud Beis 110b. That's right. And we are in the middle of our discussion of the concern of Zugoist, the consumption in pairs that invites a negative spiritual energy. And the Gemara is telling us a number of details about it, a story about it, how to respond to it, when there is and when there isn't a concern. All right. So, for example, the last statement we had was the concern. Well, first of all, we had the statement which said that there are only 4 food items that are on the list, one of which we don't know, which is why we extended it to everything out of doubt. We also had a statement which said that only that which is completed in the hands of heaven is their concern, but if it's man-manipulated, no. So cooked dishes, there's no concern with eating that in pairs. Loaves of bread, no concern with eating that in pairs. But apparently wine is included in that which is made by the hands of heaven. And presumably, as we said, because there are no other ingredients to it, you just grapes that are grape juice that's fermented. So there's no other ingredients, even though there's processing, but there's no ingredients. So I suppose that's what it is. Now, another number of different statements like this, where the Gemara limits the nature of when and how Zugos is of a concern. That's where we are. And it's a little about more than halfway down the page. A line begins with the word chanus. Chanus ein bahen. See it? It's the beginning of the line. A little bit more than halfway down the page. A bit more. Closer to a third. Closer to a third to the bottom. Yeah. Chanus, drinking in a store, meaning in a pub, or I guess any store. Apparently shoekeeper stores also sell wine, like we saw before. So drinking in a store, okay, let's just translate literally, and I'll give you 2 interpretations that Rashbam offers. Literally, it's translated as chanus, a store, ein bahen mishum zogais. There's no concern of drinking in pairs. So what does it mean, a store? So one reading is eating in 2 stores, or drinking in 2 stores. So like eating one dish in store 1 and then going to store B and drinking a dish because you're in 2 different stores. The fact that you consumed from stores in pairs is not a concern of pairs, considering that you changed location, presumably. So even though, but that's one offer you're offering in terms of understanding what this means. But then Rashbam says that there's another understanding, which is the primary understanding. The primary way to understand this is when you're consuming food in a store, then there's no concern of pairs, which should raise a question, namely, we had this story of the guy drinking wine in pairs at a store. The jealous ex-husband is drinking wine in the shoekeeper shop. And he died. Yeah, so Rashbam explains what the reason why drinking or consuming food in a store doesn't invite pairs is because it's not your permanent place of consumption. It's a temporary place. But if you're a regular at that store, then that becomes your permanent place, and therefore could invite the negative force.
Oh, and maybe that would explain why he was hanging around that establishment, not because it was where his ex-wife's new husband was, but rather he was probably there even when they were married.
Well, we're not sure which one came first. Did the alcoholism come before the jealousy come before the alcoholism? I don't know. But either way,
it was odd that he was there.
Yes, it was a permanent.
Now this would make
it became his permanent place of drinking and sin consumption.
It must have been, because otherwise the Zugos wouldn't have had effect.
That's right. Otherwise, there would be no issue with Zugos, and that's what the Gemara means here, as explained by the interpretation of Rashbam. Yeah, that if the person is in a temporary place, then no pairs. It's only when, so it's almost as if, by the way, as we'll see more soon, it's almost as if drinking in pairs requires intentionality. This is where I always am. I always sit here, and I'm now going to be consuming items in pairs. Like I'm doing so with like almost intentionality. it takes us back to the beginning as to why the sages, when the Gemara is first concerned with the sages enacting drinking 4 cups, there's an intentionality of it. You're sitting at your home, at your Seder, intentionally consuming 4 cups in a set. And that's where the concern lies for some reason.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I think he wasn't even there to torment this man at all. He may have even been friends with that man, but that was his hangout. And she didn't like it because they were already divorced.
Maybe it was their hangout. Maybe it was their hangout before they got married, before they divorced, and that led to the divorce. Maybe. Okay. The plot thickens.
I didn't like that.
Clearly.
This is just to be consistent.
Yeah. Who knows?
Anyway. Sorry.
Anyway, so the point here is it seems like there's a certain intentionality required. This is where I eat, and now I'm consuming in pairs. And therefore, if it's in the bar, it's in the restaurant, if it's not my regular place of consuming, and there's a temporary nature to the consumption of the pairs, and therefore doesn't invite the negative spiritual energy. Gemara continues, Nimlach, if in between consumption 1 and consumption 2, I at least temporarily thought I was stopping to drink, then ein b'hem shum zuga is no concern with pairs, because each one's independent of the other. Because I drank 1 cup thinking this was it, and then someone changed my mind, or I decided to change my mind, so I drank a second one. Then there's no issue of pairs, because again, I'm not drinking it in a pair. Drinking 1 and drinking 2 are a separate consumption activity, because in between, I actually thought I was done. And likewise, the Gemara continues, a guest in someone else's home, it's as if after each drink, I'm unaware of the next, because I don't know how much they're going to be drinking or how much I'm going to be served. I don't know what the host has in mind. So each drink is like an independent consumption. So it's like compounds the temporary nature of this consumption. It's not my home. It's not my regular place of eating. And I don't even know how many I'm going to be drinking or eating, because it's up to the host if they're going to give me a second glass of wine or not. So even if at the end it's an even number, I didn't drink it in an even number. I drank each one independently because that's what I was given. Right? And likewise, the Mishnah, the Gemara.
So it's like 1 plus 1.
Exactly. Exactly. It's not a unit of 2. It's 1 and then another, just like someone changed his mind in between. Each one being an independent consumption, which is one of the answers the Gemara gave for why the 4 cups of wine are not combined for negative, because each one's an independent singular consumption, not a unit of 4. Right? So again, it's all to say that it seems like this invitation of the negative spiritual energy is like where the person intentionally is fixated on consuming these in pairs. Okay, similarly, says the Gemara, Isha, a woman, ein b'ha mishum zugos. A woman should not be concerned with pairs for the same reason, because it's not the way of women to be here. Here, the Gemara is speaking specifically about the consumption of wine, as Rabbi explains, and not the other items which were on the list, right? The cucumber, eggs, and nuts, but specifically the wine issue, because a woman is not prone to drinking wine in this fixed fashion, where I sit down every night for wine. Not the way of women. And therefore, there's no concern of pairs, because again, it's only if the person does so in this like permanent fixed fashion. I'm sitting down for my 2 cups of wine right now. That's what it seems like. And therefore, Isha Chashuva, if she's a woman of prominence, where she does regularly consume wine, then Chashidon, she should be concerned, because again, she's doing so in this permanent fashion. I'm sitting down for my nightly glass of wine, or my weekly 2 glasses of wine, my weekly consumption of wine. And therefore, she should be concerned not to do so in pairs. That's what the Gemara says. So this ends the list of the limitations on where Zugas is concerned, as taught by Rabbi Avira, who began with loaves of bread and cooked dishes don't have the concern of pairs because they're manipulated by man, and then he wanted to say other things. all of which come down to, if it's not in this permanent sort of fashion and this fixed sort of fashion, then doesn't invite the negative spiritual energy. And if I'm a guest, it's no issue. If I'm not eating in my regular place, it's no issue. If I'm a woman and I don't usually consume alcohol and just so happens I'm drinking now, it doesn't, no issue. If I change my mind in between drinking cup 1 and 2, no issue, because they're not a unit of 2. And I think that was the list. Okay.
And it may not even excuse me, it may not even apply to her.
So the Gemara, this is
yes.
Again, it says it does if she's a woman of repute.
No, but it's not one of those items specifically delineated.
It's not a question of gender. It's a question of
No, I'm saying
whether there's a permanent nature to her consumption.
I'm saying that we don't even know if wine is one of the Zugoy's concerns.
Yeah.
Because we only know that
We only know 3, and there's a 4th one we're not sure of. Yeah, I have to. Yeah.
So I mean, of course, the sages said everything that could apply, but in reality, it's a probability, right, that it may not be.
Well, it seems quite clear that wine is a concern because, first of all, this guy who died as a result of someone consuming wine. We had earlier.
Well, right, that was my issue last week.
Right.
That same issue.
So then shouldn't, right, in other words, if you're not sure what the 4th is and you have people dying as a result of drinking wine in pairs, why shouldn't you just conclude that it's grape or wine and then take everything else off the table?
Right.
So I have to therefore say, going back to the original statement of Rabbi, right, who himself was concerned even with making sure the markings on his barrels were not in pairs.
Right.
Who said also that anyone who's not concerned with it, it doesn't concern with you, which makes it seem as if, and I think this is where we have to understand it. The concern with it is what invites it to begin with. So the concern with it is what invites it to begin with. So because we're not sure what the 4th item is, and therefore we concerned ourselves with all items, we therefore invited it onto all items. We have to conclude that. Otherwise, the Gemara should just say the 4th item seems to be wine. Right? So maybe it would seem like this. The 4 items, that's whether you care about it or not. The others, considering that we cared about it, we invited it because we weren't sure if it's part of the 4th item, which is there, even if you don't care about it.
Yeah.
Maybe it's one way to understand it.
Yeah.
This is my thinking. Which would mean, therefore, that when it comes to eggs, nuts, and cucumbers, whether you care about it or not, it's going to be there. Which is a big chiddush on my part. It's a big novelty to say that you have to be strict about nuts, eggs, and cucumbers, even if you're not concerned with it.
It's funny,
right? But that doesn't seem, that's not the face reading of the Gemara is not like that. I'm only giving that reading considering the Gemara clearly says that wine is a concern, and yet doesn't conclude, well, that must be the 4th item, right? So that's why I'm suggesting that maybe these 4.
I follow what you're saying.
You follow?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Perhaps I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's not definitive, but it's a sound argument. It's funny, my wife, and it's funny, you see how Gemara it gets handed down through families.
Oh, sure.
My wife may not be able to cite this Gemara, but my wife won't make eggs in pairs.
Okay, so the eggs in pairs is actually a halachic thing.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, for blood spots.
No, but
by doing it in.
I'm sure that's not.
It's not that. It's just like it's could be this. No, it's very possible. Families have these traditions that absolutely go.
Traditions that come from these.
Absolutely.
They lose the reason why behind it, but they keep.
Absolutely. Like the Rebbe told my grandmother, my mother's mother, Mrs. Treidel. So she didn't really go through school and high school because there was a war. Right. The war broke out when she was in 10, 11, somewhere there, younger maybe. So she didn't really go through normative Jewish schooling. So when she met the Rebbe, I think it was the first time, and the Rebbe asked her how she'll know how to run a Jewish home. She didn't learn in school properly. So my grandmother said that her mother was a good Hungarian Jewish woman, and she lived with her and learned from her. So what she does, she does. What her mother did, she does.
Yeah,
and the Rebbe smiled and said, "So that's very good." Right? That's the way it was for most of Jewish history for most people. didn't necessarily get an education the way we do today, where people are learning from the books.
Well, it's almost like another example of an oral tradition being
That's
passed
right.
down.
That's correct.
Like this. Like what we're doing.
100%. The oral tradition still keeps on going. Absolutely.
Someone who knows recites it to something.
Yeah. Actually, in 95 or 96, Rabbi Soloveitchik from Chicago, I think his first name was Chaim, wrote an article about this. He said it in concern, actually, that he called it mimetic Judaism. Mimetic as in like you mimic what your elders did,
okay.
as opposed to today, I guess because of the breakdown of the war, and he has a whole bunch of theories as to why, but he's concerned with the over attention to textual Judaism rather than mimetic Judaism, and that the way we live out Judaism, as we did in our homes, watching our parents and then watching their parents and watching their parents, is being lost to children who are looking at the books and saying, well, mom, you're doing it wrong because look what it says here.
Right. Because they don't really, yeah. I know.
There's like an academic element to it as opposed to a mimetic element. I think he gives another term for it, mimetic versus something else. He gave a term to it. A whole long article where he goes through this and his concerns about it, and specifically his concerns with respect to the modern Orthodox community. Whatever, an interesting article. But it's to your point,
yeah.
Where it's very, very, very possible that there's what your wife had a tradition from her mother, from her mother, from her mother.
Yeah, you don't have to go that far back.
Yeah,
they were big rabbis.
Exactly, and they taught the women. That's right, and they taught the community how to do things, and the community listened, and they followed and told their kids how to do it, and that's the end of it. 100%. Yep.
Those traditions don't come back.
100%. Yeah. Okay. See, in this regard, it's going to come up actually, God willing, in our series, Meet the Giants, and we go through women. So part of it's going to be about how many sages will look to their mothers for tradition. How do they do this? How did your grandmother do the koshering of the chicken? How did your grandmother do this?
Yeah,
as a way of
comes from.
Yep, a lot of that tradition element, sages would look to their mothers, starting with Abaye, which we had earlier, right? Abaye, about his mother, well, his adopted mother.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, yeah. So we're going to be discussing that.
I learned something about chicken egg in the hymn, right? Eggs found inside a chicken that have not yet been born out.
Right. Have been laid.
Considered meat.
Yeah.
And that's the tradition of knitting of the hymn.
There's a few things like that.
Oh,
when it comes to laws of Nida as well, there's quite a few women took it upon themselves. Anyway, we're going to discuss it, God willing, when we get there. All right, the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Chanina bar Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Chanina, son of Rabbi Yeshua, said, asparagus, this drink asparagus, which we had, it's not asparagus.
No,
at least the way that Rashbam tells us. It's, sorry?
Like a beet soup, oil in it?
So we had different versions in the Gemara, different points. We had one which was beet in oil.
Here, that was in brachas.
In brachas. Here, Rashbam tells us, it could be there's other, I'm sure there's other commentaries that give us different interpretation here, but Rashbam tells us it's a mix of cabbage and wine. And Rashbam tells us that it was something that they would drink in the morning before they ate for medicinal purposes. Started your day with cabbage wine. Different reality there.
Digestive system.
The consumption of wine was much more prevalent then than it is today. Anyway, so this asparagus drink, this cabbage wine drink, because it's medicinal, mitzdaref l'toiva, combines for good, ve'ein mitzdaref l'ra, and doesn't combine for bad. Meaning to say like this: if you drank 2 cups of wine, so you're in a state of zugais, and then you drank asparagus, this will now combine to bring it into goodness, right? But if you drank 1 cup of wine, and now you drank this asparagus, it would not combine to bring it into negative. So it combines only where it would lead you to an odd number, as in bring you to a good place, but will not combine to bring you to an even number, which would bring you to a bad place. And this is because it is a medicinal item. Because it's medicinal, therefore it only combines for good, not for negative. So there's another thing. in addition to the fact that I'm drinking or consuming it's all around wine all the time, but it's, in addition to the fixed nature and the permanent nature of my consumption in a pair, there's also, am I doing this just for my own pleasure now? Or is there a medicinal element to it? And if I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it because of what's good and right, in this case, medicinal, then it doesn't have the negative effect, right? So, which leads me to believe two things, something we spoke about before, which is the nature of negative spiritual energy and its association with two, considering that two is conflict, right? We spoke about this, where when the Gemara talked about putting your thumbs into your thumb and keep on counting, you and I are three, no, you and I are two, no, you and I are three, until you got to like
100.
right 100. And we suggested that perhaps the point there is, right, that perhaps 101, right? We suggested that perhaps two or even numbers are conflict, whereas three is reconciliation, right? Like the two verses that contradict each other, and the third verse comes to reconcile, right? That one of the 13 principles, right? And that's why you put the thumb inside the thumb, because you're like taking one side and the other and trying to reconcile between the two, putting them into each other. This was our suggestion. So if that's the case, conflict, right? Conflict in two coming into conflict is only when each side is stuck and fixed on its side. So there's a permanent nature. I'm now combining two. It's almost like I'm stuck in my position and there is a conflict here, and that's the negativity that's invited, right? So there's like a selfish nature to that conflict. Like all conflict is rooted in selfishness. I'm stuck in my position. I cannot hear on the other side. And therefore, everything I touch is conflict. Unless I can invite a third party that can reconcile between the two of us and validate both our opinions and allow us to come together. But to begin with, I approach it with a humility of, it's not me drinking and consuming and standing in my position. I'm not fixed on drinking in pairs. I'm drinking it for medicinal reasons. I'm doing it because it's the right and good thing. So to begin with, my consumption, my position has a humility and therefore only combines for good, not for negative. Because if I stake my position, right? In other words, there's a possibility for two people not to come together in conflict. Doesn't always, two is the number of conflict, but it doesn't have to be. It's only potentially, it's only conflict if each side is stuck in its position. And that's why there's this fixed nature to the negative. And it's only when it's for selfish reasons.
But if you enter.
But if I enter to begin with, where I'm just here because it's the right thing and the good thing and the proper thing, it's medicinal, as it were, then it only combines for good. And I can see someone else's position, and it's not conflict because I'm not here to like prove myself. I'm sharing where I feel and how this is right and this is good, and I'm listening to you. So it doesn't have to be conflict when there's two. It's potentially conflict until the third can come and reconcile the two. But it's only there. It's only a conflict if each side is dug his heels in and stuck under the position. There's a permanent nature to this consumption. Kind of paraphrasing the Gemara's terminology.
Stubbornness.
There's a stubbornness to it. That's right. There's a stubbornness to it. That's right. And the medicinal consumption represents the open-mindedness to the position, not the stubborn nature of it. The permanency element that he keeps on referring to here indicates a stubbornness to it. And that's why there's conflict in two. And you have to have the third to reconcile. But if to begin with, I entered this in a temporary nature, and that I'm not like so fixed on my position, it's temporary. I'm doing so for medicinal reasons. I'm just here to open and honest to the truth. And even if there's two, it doesn't have to be negative.
It's funny, this story.
This is perhaps a deeper reading of what's happening here.
It's very funny because this story is almost like a story within a story. This story is actually this story in the Gemara is explaining the Gemara.
Yeah.
Because the Gemara is a whole treatise on how to reconcile conflict.
Oh, it does. That's right. It's very nice. The Gemara is all about trying to reconcile conflict. That's very good. Yeah. So maybe going back to the story of the jealous ex-husband, right? His drinking and consuming in that place in a permanent nature is indicative of the fixated conflict nature of his presence.
Yeah,
the stubbornness. And that's why no matter how much he drank, even if he was up to 16, it was way past 10.
Yeah.
Right? Still an issue. And the Gemara said, why was it an issue? Because there's a witch involved. Right? When there's a witch involved, even past 10, it's a problem. right? Perhaps what that
Well,
means.
he invited the witch.
Exactly. That's what it means. Because he's so stuck in his way, inviting that conflict, no matter how far you go, it's going to be a problem.
Right.
You're fixed.
There's a
You're
lot
there.
of leniency
That's
built
right.
into this, but if you're stubborn enough,
Exactly.
it can keep going.
Right. There's all kinds of ways out of conflict. There's all kinds of ways out of negativity. But if you're stuck in that place, you're jealous, right? Jealousy is a big motivator in selfishness and making one dig their heels in and saying, no, I'm here, right? So you're stuck in this position of conflict. You're stuck in this position of even numbers, which are at odds with each other, right? And therefore, there's a witch involved. I'm fighting against this thing. Then it's a problem. It invites.
It's a parasite that keeps growing.
It's a parasite that keeps growing. It keeps on inviting and consuming negativity. But if, as we're learning here, I'm just drinking it for medicinal purposes, it's a temporary thing. I'm not so fixed on my position. I'm not so stuck in my place. I can reconcile. I can hear someone else's position. This is just medicinal purposes, right? Medicinal actually is related to tshuva, right? The Gemara tells us that tshuva brings refuah, brings healing to the world, right? So there's a tshuva element. There's a humility element here. I'm not so fixed and stuck here. So then there's no conflict, and then there's no pairs issue.
So presumably,
perhaps this is a way to understand the Gemara.
Maybe this is too literal, but presumably, the asparagus story was just an example of a medicinal, but the wine itself could be medicinal, right? I mean, two glasses of wine, if drunk in a medicinal intent, may as well,
perhaps
even as well.
Yep.
Be considered.
Yep.
Not a pair for Zubas.
Yep. It doesn't.
I don't know.
It doesn't say so, but taking Rashbam at face value, which explains the reason why asparagus is not a problem is because of its medicinal nature. So if you're drinking wine for medicinal purposes, I imagine you're correct.
Yeah.
Let's see if Rashi.
That may not.
Rashi does not make mention of the. It doesn't make mention of the medicinal nature. Doesn't make mention of that. But here's something interesting. Actually, I just noticed. I'm looking at Rashi. The Gemara began today by saying that when you're drinking in a store, no concern. What about the story of the guy who drank in the store? So Rashbam said, well,
he was a regular. Remember?
Okay, so one. Okay, Rashbam also makes mention of this. One issue is that he's a regular. Another issue, which Rashi highlights even more, but Rashbam also seems to be saying a similar thing, that there's an issue of a witch, and Rashbam's add specifically a witch that you turned into your divorcee, meaning you're stuck in a conflict there. And that's why there's a problem. Otherwise, it would have been fine because it's totally temporary. You're just drinking at a store. But because there's a witch involved, and as Rashbam puts it, you made that witch into your divorcee, you made her into your object of conflict. So now there's an issue. Maybe. Again, maybe. Yeah. So, perhaps, again, this is not the literal reading of the Gemara. This is my suggested deeper reading, but as with all Gemaras that are agadic in nature, the intention there is to invite you to think about it and derive moral value and lesson. So even if it's not the Gemara's intent, considering the good lesson it brings us, I would think it's a valid interpretation, even if it's not in the Gemara directly, but perhaps. And with that in mind, God willing, tomorrow we'll see more qualifications for how Zugais works and what to do if you're not sure. If you drank 2 or 3, what do you do? If you drink another one and risk it being 4, you don't know. We'll talk about that. And I think with the frame we just gave, we might be able to understand some more of the Gemara as we go forward. Okay, wonderful day, Eden. We'll hear good news, God willing, from everyone.